Today on Locked On Red Wings, which teams in the Atlantic Division could be risers and fallers?
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. Scotty's also the host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. Also, you know what? This is ad-libbed, just not scripted, but I want to give a round of applause to good friend, former host of the show, Nolan Bianchi, who just accepted the full-time role with the Detroit News as the Detroit Lions beat writer. So, absolutely congratulations, Nolan. It's crazy thinking about where we started back in the pandemic, right? Just sitting around on Zoom calls, chit-chatting for hours, talking to you guys particularly, because I wasn't, in news journalism like that, talking about writing articles and the grind that it is. And now here he is going to be the full-time Detroit Lions beat writer for the Detroit News. So just awesome stuff for Nolan, and we could not be happier for him. Welcome back to Locked On Red Wings, and thanks for making us your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And as the playoffs have wound down now, the sports have stopped sporting like you want them to, minus the Tigers, who don't look at them anymore. They're losing and they're trading guys away. But they're still playing. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Scotty, on today's episode, we're going to talk to the people about the rest of the Atlantic Division. And yeah, we'll talk Red Wings, kind of have to, right? They're part of the Atlantic Division. And whether or not we found these teams to be risers or fallers after their off-season of moves. Obviously, July 29th, July 30th, whenever you're listening to this, there's still time for all these teams to make moves, but the majority of their big-time moves are already finished. So, Scotty, without further ado, why don't we start at the top chronologically to where these teams finished last season? And that would be with the Florida Panthers. When it comes to who the Florida Panthers lost and gained, where do you have them as a potential riser or faller?
Well, it's hard to be a riser. It's hard for Florida to rise too terribly much from the season. They just had, obviously, first place and Stanley Cup champs. So hard to get better. But I do not expect them to have a big dramatic fall off like we've seen from some teams in the past. They were able to hold on to a decent amount of their core. Obviously, there was a lot of players in that almost has, this sounds like offensive to like those players. I'm not trying to shade anybody, but like players that were more in the margins, right? That maybe weren't a part of like the hardcore like core of the team that they lost and whatnot. But yeah, I'm not too worried about Florida. Like I still fully expect them to be one of the best teams in the NHL and be pushing deep into the postseason next year. I do not expect them to be a huge faller in terms of the Atlantic outlook. I guess maybe there's a conversation that one of the two teams below them leapfrogs, but at the end of the day, I really don't even see that happening.
Yeah, I wouldn't anticipate that happening. I think in terms of risers or fallers, they're more of a stand pat. That third option I did not list. They're kind of right there. Like, well, yes, they did, and let's not get it twisted. They did lose quality pieces this offseason. Yeah. Obviously, Vladimir Tarasenko, who they acquired at the trade deadline, now a Detroit Red Wing. Montour is gone. Lomberg is gone. Stolarz, who had a fantastic season as the backup, is now gone. But those guys are as good of players as they were, especially Montour, who had a breakout year. They're not the core of the team. And when we're talking about players that they've gained through the offseason, I'm counting guys they've re-signed as and retained as the additions category, right? Like Sam Reinhart, locking him up. Like he could have gotten 10 plus million on the free agent market, but because this team, I mean, one, you're in Florida, right? Like just a beautiful state in terms of weather, and you're on a championship caliber team, and the tax breaks don't hurt. Weather's good most of the time, except for hurricane season. You got Reinhart still. Huge retention by them on a championship team. You re-signed Kulikov. You re-signed Anton Lundell. You got Chris Drieger back as your backup once again. He was a former Florida Panther. He's back. He's a quality backup, and you still have Spencer Knight. So the goaltending core around Sergei Bobrovsky is still there. I can't see them getting deep. I think, like you said, there's a conversation with how good the top half of the Atlantic Division is that one of these teams could leapfrog them, but I don't see that happening. I think Florida is still going to stay there as the number one Atlantic Division champions going into next year with how good that core of that team still is and how well they play that system.
For sure.
Awesome. With that, we move on to second place, which you and I had to refresh ourselves on. We were like, was it Toronto or Boston that finished second? It was indeed the Boston Bruins. And Boston, this one's one of the more interesting conversations, I think.
For sure.
I'm going to go out on a limb here before even going on to talk about who they've lost and gained. I think that they could potentially be a faller, and I think that's more of a consequence of the short-term gains that Toronto gained rather than what Boston did. Boston, obviously, big loss in Linus Ullmark. He's one of your the best goalie tandem in the NHL with Swayman and Ullmark. They traded him to the Ottawa Senators in exchange for picks and Jonas Korpisalo, who has, 1-2 years left on his deal. Korpisalo is probably going to be a serviceable backup behind a very good Boston Bruins team, but losing Ullmark and having is going to hurt, and we will see if Swayman is capable of carrying an entire season's worth of workload. Instead of being like 1A, 1B, you have a 1 now. And it remains to be seen if he can up to that. I think he is. Outside of that, they also gained Elias Lindholm, Nikita Zadorov, and of course, like I mentioned, Korpisalo. They gave big money out to Lindholm and Zadorov, and those are good players. Don't get me wrong. But they're good middle, as Eisman would say, role players. Like, they just overpaid for those guys, but in terms of like quality of the team, I think those roles they did improve, but it's not the top end talent at center they still need with the Lindholm signing.
Yeah. I don't know. We have been talking about Boston's potential fall for like years on this show. Like every offseason, everybody has the conversation of is this the year they fall? Is this the year? Like, people retire. Is this the year? Is this the year? And I don't think either of us are saying that they're going to be like terrible. It's just a matter of whether that slide a little bit down happens this year. Maybe it's gradually been happening over the years and it's just not been prevalent enough to really point out. Regardless, I still think the core and the depth of this team is still so great that they are going to be toward the top of the division yet again.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even have them falling past Toronto, like, personally. And we'll have a preview conversation like we usually do before the regular season starts. It's still July at the end of the day, but just from off-season moves, like, I still think Boston is the second best team in this division. And I think that a lot of that, again, has to do with depth. I mean, like you said, they didn't add a ton of like super high-end talent. They do obviously still have something that they need to address in trying to get a 1C again. But like, at the end of the day, there's still so much talent top to bottom on this roster. I still expect them to be around 110 points again.
Right, and we're talking about a Lindholm that this last year between the Canucks and the Flames had a total of 44 points. That's not that's like second line center, a fringe second line center material, but it's not a top line center, which is still something they desperately need. But they, of course, like you said, they have Pasternak, they have Brad Marchand, like they still have Swayman. Obviously, another big loss that they had was Jake DeBrusk as well on the offensive side of things, and he signed in Vancouver. So some shuffling around, and I want to put a distinction there too between falling and faller is different in terms of like I'm not predicting Boston is falling off. That's not what I'm trying to say. I've said that the last 2 years straight, and it hasn't proven true. So I know better, but I wouldn't be surprised if, because of Toronto's gains, especially affecting their biggest needs, that they maybe are able to usurp them, because there wasn't a huge gap between those two teams. I think it's going to come down to the wire and battle it out. But I think they are what I would say a potential faller to one spot in the division. Not saying to bottom the division, but from 2 to 3. That's not like a huge indictment of the Boston Bruins. They're still going to be in that mix.
Yeah.
Let's go to a quick break, Scotty, and when we return, we'll talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs, who finished third. Then after that means Tampa, Detroit, they're on, and to the end of the episode we go. So stay tuned to segment 2 of Locked On Red Wings. Got to talk to you guys today about FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But hockey's over. The basketball Summer League Championship's over. We got baseball, and we got the Summer Olympics. But if those don't strike your fancy, don't worry. FanDuel still has stuff for you. All you got to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you want if you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are talking about potential risers and fallers within the division. Scotty, I mean, you already know where I stand on Toronto. I kind of spoiled it with my idea that they may rise from 3 to 2. Why don't you break down who they've lost and who they've gained?
Yeah, Toronto is, like you said, kind of fascinating too. I really do think that when you're talking about teams that could swap or the potential for movement, a lot of it is going to revolve around either Toronto and or Boston. I think that with Toronto specifically, I don't know, man. Like I obviously they lose Bert, which is, something. I think that
the way you said that, it just made
Bert's
me chuckle.
Great. We obviously love Bert, but I think when it comes to my expectations of Toronto, I just think it's very similar to last season. Like, obviously, they had a relatively busy offseason, but to me, like, at the end of the day, I think that similar to the conversation with Florida, but the opposite, like, that I'm gonna make that make sense here in a second. it's one of those things where, like, Florida, I don't expect to fall because their core is still intact. Toronto, I don't expect to take a huge leap forward because their same core is still intact. Does that make sense? Like, I obviously, again, they went out and they did spend some money. They had a relatively busy offseason, but like at the end of the day, this is going to completely come down to the core that has been established there for a while. And I don't expect to see a giant change one way or another in the Leafs seasons or postseason rather, success or lack thereof going forward.
Right. And I mean, like and this is why I feel like Toronto has the ability to pass up Boston this year. And a lot of it's short-term gains, as I've said. Like they inked Tanev, who's 34 years old, to a 4-year deal. And they inked Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who's 33, to a 4-year deal. I'm sorry, Tanev was a 6-year deal, which is even worse at 34 years old. So one you're going to have until he turns 40. The other one you're going to have until he turns 37. Long-term outlook on that isn't great, but that's what going all in for a Stanley Cup is. The short-term outlook in terms of the 24-25 season is going to give them a boost. I mean, Oliver Ekman-Larsson last year, the Florida Panthers had 32 points in 80 games. That's going to give them a nice option on the defensive side of the puck for offense on the power play. And Chris Tanev is going to solve a huge issue. One of the huge issues they've had is that for years they've had shoddy goaltending and they've had shoddy defense. And Chris Tanev, despite his age, is still a very high quality and high caliber defenseman. He was taking top pair minutes in the Calgary Flames system. He got traded to Dallas and he was still playing big time minutes. Now he's not going to go out there and he's not going to get you, a ton of points. That's not his role, but he's a big body defensive defenseman. And then on top of that, they acquired Anthony Stolarz, who I've previously mentioned had a really nice season behind, granted, a very good Florida Panthers defense. But if he is even, 75% of as good as he showed with Florida in actuality, that's going to massively upgrade their goaltending. And I know that they've as well thought that, they have Wool as well, some guys in their system they think could be Samsonov as well, they think could be the answer. And they also retained Domi, which I'm kind of lukewarm on it. They could only retain Bert or Domi as one of the two, but brings a nice physical edge. So I think Toronto did enough to address their biggest needs, at least in the short term, for a team that's trying to give it all for a Stanley Cup, to go to second in the division. I don't know about third, but or first rather, but second for sure. I think they are a potential riser by one spot.
Right. And at the end of the day, like 109 points versus 102 points last year, Boston. So that's what, 7? Like Boston loses 4 or 5 points and Toronto gains 3 or 4 points. And you're talking about a swap there. Like that's definitely not out of the question at all. And then I think the one that is somewhat out of the question for you and I is Tampa being a riser at 4. Yeah. I think for me, like this is the one that I have highlighted as I don't know. Again, I kind of have it chalk in the first 3 that we've talked about. So this is kind of my first, like I could really see a fall here. And that's, again, not like you said earlier, not a fall off. That's not saying Tampa's going to be some garbage hockey team by any stretch, but I do think that they have just been gradually on the decline year after year after year after year ever since the Stanley Cups. And so I think that they're at a point now, they don't reach 100 points last season, and they are starting to lose core pieces, right? Like that inevitably happens to all title contending teams. Eventually the core starts to even break up, and obviously that's something that happened with Toronto, like very notably lost Stamkos. Wings fans thought we were going to get him there for a few seconds, maybe on that first day of free agency. But that's obviously a huge loss for them. I think, and they made some solid additions too. That's not to say that they only lost. I don't think that this is going to be a bad hockey team. I think that a lot of people are still going to have them in 4th in the Atlantic. But if there is a route for the Wings specifically, 91 points in 5th place to kind of catapult themselves into the top 4, I think it's almost certainly going to be in place of Tampa.
Yeah, it's there. I can show you too. Like I have WTF with circled arrow at Tampa Bay because they're so hard to predict. Because if they had, let's say they had brought everyone back, like right, I would have been like faller because it's another year older with the same core. But they shook it up, and you know, as much as I don't respect the way that they handled the end of the Stamkos era, I do respect the balls it takes to shake up your core that massively to try and keep the winning alive. Sure. Doesn't mean I agree with every single play. Like replacing Stamkos, who did score 40 goals, but was, 34 years old, with 26-year-old Jake Guentzel, who was also capable of 40 goals and got better away from Sidney Crosby this last year after the trade deadline to Carolina. That's a huge gamble, but like that could pay dividends. But at the same time, you know, you traded away Sergachev, who is still in his 20s, for 34-year-old Ryan McDonaugh, who you've already had. And Sergachev obviously doesn't produce as much offense as, at least this past year, as McDonaugh. McDonaugh had a nice resurgent year with the Nashville Predators, one of the reasons that helped lead them back into the playoffs. And so, like you said, it's kind of a wash, but at the same time, they're like the most interesting to watch.
Right.
Like in one hand, I could be like, they're younger on offense, so I could see them as a potential riser, but they got older on defense, and the rest of the core is older as well, so I could see them as a potential faller. They're just one, like, I think WTF circle is that's the secret 4th option of I shrug my shoulders. I literally don't know. And then this is one that's going to be like, you have to kind of watch how the season plays out, because as of right now, like they're still good enough, right? Like they got Kucherov, they got Vasilevsky, they re-upped Hedman, McDonough's good, Guentzel's very good. You got Braden Point, who's excellent. Like they're gonna be in the playoff mix. I don't think they're gonna fall out of the wild card race. But could I see them fall to 2nd wild card? Sure. But could I see them challenge for the 3rd in the division? Also true. So they're just a weird spot for me. I don't know. I really don't know. I think they're a fascinating team to watch this year.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, again, I think potential faller is like it's if there is one in the top 4, I think it kind of almost by default has to be them. But that doesn't mean that it's going to happen, and that doesn't even mean that it's likely. I kind of like their offseason, like you said. I think with the gradual decline they've been on, I don't know. It's weird because like you said, I mean, they've been on the gradual decline, but they also shook it up and brought in a lot of new talent. So I'm kind of lockstep with you. But again, I do think that if there is potential for a faller for the Wings to get into the top 4, it would be them surpassing Tampa, most likely.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that one. Scott, we got to take another quick break. When we return, we'll finish off the last 4 teams in this division. So it's going to be a long segment 3, it sounds like. So stay tuned for that in segment 3 of Locked On Red Wings. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. So we're at 5th place in the Atlantic Division, Scotty, and you know what that means. We got to talk Detroit Red Wings. And obviously, Locked On Red Wings podcast. But at the same time, you've heard us talk a lot about the Red Wings additions and subtractions. So I think we'll try to keep this brief for you guys. Obviously, subtractions, you know, they traded away Jake Wallman. They traded away Robbie Fabry. They lost a ton, of players, it feels like, through free agency, losing Gostisbehere, who is, despite his defensive warts, was really good on the power play, had 50-plus points. David Perron walked away. Daniel Sprong is gone as well. And James Reimer left. But in return, you got Vladimir Tarasenko. You re-upped Patrick Kane. You're going to re-up Seider and Raymond and Berggren. You re-upped Johansson and Veleno. Kept Christian Fischer as well. Brought in Eric Gustafsson, Cam Talbot. Anyone? Tyler Mott. Am I forgetting anyone? Like this roster saw a lot of turnover.
I don't think it was as busy as last offseason, but another offseason where the Wings brought in a lot. I mean, we again, we don't have to spend too much time on the Wings, to be honest. You and I have talked about kind of where we stand with them a lot, and I think that it's a different style that's going to get them probably around the same point total. And we've even cited that there's a very real possibility that there's even a slight step back just because of the amount of youth that is going to be playing and the amount of rookies that are probably going to debut for the Wings this season. But I think that if you were to give me an option of rise, fall, or stand pat for the Wings, I would probably choose stand pat as it stands right now.
Right, and I think part of that conversation has to do with if they were to fall, I would say it's more due to their own I don't want to say problems, that's not the right word, but hurdles as a team with roster turnover and some youth joining the team, rather than a team behind them really making a huge resurgent push. But like at the same time, I can't see them as a riser either, because again, we're talking about the Tampa Bay Lightning who finished in 4th, and Tampa, you up and down their roster, it's clear as day. They are a better roster still. Kucherov, Point. I don't have to list them all off. I already did. Guentzel. So, I mean, as he goes on. I just don't see this roster still being enough to surpass Tampa, barring a huge step back or like the new players they brought in not meshing. I think that, and we've talked about it, they're as good as they were last year, just in a different way. I think that they can supplement a lot of the goals they lost through a full season of Patrick Kane, a healthy Dylan Larkin, DeBrincat's not hitting the post as much, right? And like some of the younger guys and new guys they brought in also supplementing. So I think the scoring will be close. I think they'll be better defensively to then finish and close that gap and differential as well. But I just don't see them being better by a lot if they are at all. If anything, I see their points being a potential faller, but I don't know if they'll fall in the standings either. And a lot of that has to do with the teams that are right behind them. And I mean, this last year, was it Buffalo finished in 6th? I can't even remember anymore.
No, Buffalo was 6th at 84 points, and they were even, 6 points ahead of Ottawa and 7. But
and what did Buffalo do during this offseason?
Right, and that's the biggest thing we talked about before we hit record too. Was like looking at these bottom 3 teams, I don't expect Buffalo to fall off a cliff. They still have a lot of talent on that roster to at least maintain what they were at. They won more games than they lost. Like last season, they weren't a terrible team. This is just a really good division, but I mean. Yeah, they didn't go out and address a lot of their issues. They still have a pretty massive defensive problem. That's not necessarily just the blue line. Obviously, they have Dahlin and Power, but they just 2 years ago they were the glass cannon that just outscored their problems, and last year they couldn't do that, and they still were not that great defensively. And so now they just roll into this offseason. They don't address a whole lot, and you're kind of just hoping for some continued natural growth and progression of youth, which is fine. And we'll talk about Ottawa and Montreal, like, and where that stands compared to them. But I don't expect Buffalo to fall. I'm certainly not going to go out on a limb and say they're going to get much better either.
I think they could fall, and I think that's, again, a subsequent. I think that's more to do with Ottawa than it does with Buffalo.
Right, like Ottawa's a team that I have as a riser for sure, and like, I know that's like sacrilegious to say on here, and we all hate Ottawa and whatnot. But like, I think they had not like the biggest offseason in the world, but they certainly had, brought in some high-end talent. They obviously, interdivision trades are always fascinating to me. And so bringing in, not only having an interdivision trade, but also making that, a guy who is presumably going to be carry a lot of the workload in net for them is going to be fascinating there. But I also just think that this core has just like underperformed so much that, I don't know, maybe I'm just, I don't really know. Like maybe I'm stupid, which I'm sure plenty of people think already. But like, I think when it comes to Ottawa, like I just expect the core players they have to.
They are reverse Boston.
To be a part of a better hockey team. You know what I mean? Like I expect that core is not old. They're talented. Like if they were to blow it up tomorrow and just sell everything, they'd get hauls for a lot of their players. Like they have a talented core, and now they have a really good goalie. I think that there is a world in which Ottawa is not only a riser, but maybe even a pretty decent riser.
Well, and that's the thing too, is like they're the reverse Boston. Like every year we expect Boston to fall. Every year we think Ottawa's going to take that step forward.
Yeah, but they did the one year. And Ottawa being the worst team you've ever seen until American Thanksgiving. That's like it's the three guarantees in life are those three things. They cannot get off to a good start if everything depended on it. So I mean, we'll see. They've been wildly disappointing year after year after year. I'm not trying to be a Sens apologist, certainly, but I expect more out of this core, and I do think that bringing in Ullmark is going to be a very, very big addition for that team.
It's really fascinating too, because like going back to Buffalo too, just to finish up my thoughts on them, they are a team that has high scoring offense. Like they score a lot of goals. But I said going into last season, I'm like, okay, that's great. But if you don't fix your defense, you won't make the playoffs. And then we started saying the same thing against the Red Wings. And guess what? Both things happen to be true. And I said, if you don't fix your defense, you're going to take a step back. And they did. And then like this offseason, did they address that again? No. Last year, their offense wasn't as potent, but they had a really nice breakout year by Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, who they signed to a big-time contract. He had a .910 save percentage, which is pretty well above the league average last year because goaltending was down. They still believe in Devon Levi, but they lost Jeff Skinner, who scored nearly 30 goals for him and I admit it, he made too much money to score just 30 goals. He was making almost $9 million a year, but that's one of your best goal scorers who's now gone. Olofsson gone, Jurgensen was gone, but they still have plenty of offense left on that team. Talk had 59 points, Dahlin had 59 points, Thompson had 56, and a lot of those guys missed quite a bit of time. Thompson missed 11 games last year. But again, like you look at the defensive side of the puck, and it's just like I don't see a lot there to write home about. And like while the young players that they have, like Zach Benson's going to be really good, continue to get better, like if you don't address the gaping hole they have defensively and the defensive system, and granted they brought in Lindy Ruff as well, I don't see how they're going to take a massive step forward, but I could also be wrong. Maybe Lindy Ruff comes in, plays a system that is better defensively, and they take a huge step forward. That's the thing, right? Like they have enough offensive talent to be a legit threat in this division, but I just don't trust the defensive side of the puck. Dahlin and Power are great, but I don't trust the defensive side of the puck for that team. And that's where it comes with Ottawa. Like, Ottawa didn't really do a whole lot to shake up their roster, minus two big moves. Linus Ullmark, which was a huge add for them. And they gave up Korpisalo and picks. Like, you got rid of your bad goaltender and brought in one of the best, a Vezina winner, in return. And like Ullmark alone could be, they still need to play better defensive hockey too. And that's like Detroit and Buffalo. That's what's holding their team back currently, is the inability to play good defensive hockey. But Ullmark has the ability to bail you out and steal games. The question mark with Ullmark is the same that it is around Swayman, is can he carry the workload as a starter, because before they were splitting the starts. But if he proves to be the goalie that Boston thought he was, as he was in Boston, that could be enough. Yeah, they lost Chychrun, which sucks. He didn't want to be there, and they only got Nick Jensen back in return, who's on the downside of his career, but they re-upped Pinto as well, who's talented. And like you were saying, Scotty, like the Brady Tkachuk, Claude Giroux, like they Tim Stutzla, Jake Sanderson, like they got talent. They should be a team that's pushing, and every year they don't. So like I think Buffalo will be a potential faller because I think Ottawa will be a potential riser. And that's not a slight against Buffalo's young pool of talent. But I think Ottawa, just getting a Vezina caliber goaltender goes a long way to helping you get better.
I completely agree. Like I said, I don't want to just retread. That's
I already
a lot
retreaded.
of the sentiments I shared too. Like I think that I would, as it stands right now, again in July, I would have Ottawa being a riser and Buffalo probably falling a little bit standings wise, maybe not a ton points wise. And then the only team left is the Habs, who, as you put it before we hit record, intentionally kind of had a quiet offseason. And I think that they're just really looking for natural growth and progression from the young players that they have, which is gonna, that's an exciting place to be. You're not going to win too many hockey games, but you got to also remember that this wasn't, the Habs weren't the stereotypical like bottom feeder. Like they didn't have like 50 points. Like they were behind Ottawa. They weren't like a complete travesty out there. They ended with 76 points on the season. Like there is a really good young core forming over there, and we've talked about it every offseason, and I continue to kind of pound the table about it. Like in I don't know, maybe it'll take still a couple of years even from now, but there's going to be a really good team that comes out of this Habs rebuild. And I think that people should start taking notice of it now, because they won 30 games last year. Like they weren't, they weren't some, like, oh, we're tanking to get the number one pick type of thing. Like they put together a pretty good season, and they're very young. And I do expect them to still be at the bottom of this division ultimately. But again, bottom of this division could be, pushing 80 points.
You could argue too, right? Like their biggest, really the only ad they make, I guess it's not even an argument, was extending Juraj Slafkovsky to that big contract. That was really the only move that they made. You could argue as well that like maybe being a fun bad team was bad for the rebuild because it gave them worse lottery odds. Like being a team that's a tank team finishing with 76 points isn't good for your lottery odds, especially post revamp lottery where you actually tend to win. where you're slotted, but that's neither here nor there, and that's for Locked On Canadiens to talk about. But here, for our purposes, like they like you said, exactly as you said, they got a really good young team. Nick Suzuki's proven to be a really capable captain who's a lot better than I think a lot of people thought he was. Juraj Slafkovsky turned it on last year and turned into a player that they were hoping he would be, with still, I think, more left till he reaches this season. They got Hudson as well, and everyone loves Cole Caulfield. So, like, they got a nice, young, exciting core. But like you said, it was an intentionally quiet offseason because they're not ready to make that step into contention. But that doesn't mean I think they're going to be bad. Like, we saw it at the end of the year. Like, Montreal had us by our throats until the last couple minutes of both those games where we had to pull a miracle out of our ass and win them just to ultimately get eliminated anyways. But, you can't sleep. That's the thing about this division is, like, you can't sleep on any of these teams. Like every single, minus Montreal, who's still, they're going to go out there and compete every night. But every single one of these teams is looking to take a step forward or retain their spot. You don't have the blessing of being some of these Western Conference divisions where half your division is in a perpetual rebuild. And so it's really just competing with four other teams. Like you have to, if you want to make the playoffs, you really have to earn it, which makes predicting the risers and the fallers in this episode so difficult. So I guess to recap real quickly, Scotty, for me personally, not to speak for you, but for me personally, I think Boston is a potential riser. I'm sorry, Toronto is a potential riser over Boston, which would make Boston a potential faller, again, by one spot. I think Tampa, I don't know. I think it could go either way. I really don't know. I'm just throwing my shoulders up. I think Detroit is going to stand pat or be a potential faller if the youth doesn't, help supplement that scoring. Buffalo, potential faller. Ottawa, potential riser. And Montreal, I think, is going to stay still.
Yeah, the only one I'm really confident about is Ottawa being a riser. And that's even like,
that's a
who does that? That's a dangerous game to play right there. There's a lot of people in Canada that say that every year and are left disappointed. So that's the only one that I really have a strong stance on. Again, like you said, Tampa, I think if there is anyone in the top 4 to fall, it's Tampa, but that doesn't mean that that's going to happen. It just means it's the most likely of those teams. I don't know. And we'll talk plenty more about the Wings, and we've already talked about that a lot, kind of where we stand on that. But yeah, I think, man, like the top, this division was the best division in hockey last year. The top 4 teams didn't get worse, and the bottom 4 teams, like the bottom, maybe got better. Like it's terrifying. Actually, I think is kind of my takeaway.
I'm pretty sure you said that exact same thing this time last season.
Correct.
Pretty sure. Anyway, Scotty, that about does it. Do you have any final thoughts?
We ball, baby.
We do ball. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Same time, same place. To your team every day.
Every day.